Hi there, and welcome to my Neltharion's Lair Mythic Dungeon Guide. Once again, not to be confused with Neltharis. In this video, I'll extensively cover the abilities of all enemies you will face in a Neltharion's Lair run. Neltharion's Lair is one of the mechanically easier dungeon among the Season 2 lineup, and there really aren't very many unique enemies. I'll be making a dungeon guide on all 8 of the slated Mythic Plus dungeons for Dragonflight Season 2. I'll also be uploading a recap video every week where I discuss the cool new tips and tricks I've discovered over the weeks. If you want to catch either of those, be sure to subscribe. Just like with my previous guides, I'll be marking out abilities with their associated counterplay, including magic effects, enrages, curses, interrupts, bleeds for Draktheirs, and poisons or diseases. Let's begin! At the start of the dungeon, you encounter the Valshard Crawler. There are a whole bunch of them, but they don't do anything. They only cast acid splatter when they die, spawning a puddle of hurt. Just don't walk over them. The crawlers will be surrounded by an Embershard Scorpion that only does a tank hit that applies a dot. This may make it dangerous when you pull multiple of them, but even then they're not very threatening. In the water to your left is a group of Rockback Gnashers. They only cast Bone Chomp, a tank hit that applies a bleed. You might notice that these mobs only have one mechanic, and that is fairly common throughout the dungeon. This is going to be a quick video. Among the trash in the first area, you might find a Tar Spitter Lurker. You'll face them again later in the dungeon, so pay attention. Just like the crawlers from earlier, they drop a puddle of hurt on death. But they also cast Submerge, submerging into the ground and appearing somewhere else. When they appear, they'll start spitting in a direction. You'll want to avoid this frontal. Next is a pretty big mob called the Valshard Hulk. You will also see more of these later in the dungeon, so pay attention. They cast Fracture, a tank frontal that knocks back, so don't stand near your tank. They also cast Piercing Shards, a very familiar ability. The Crystal Furies and Azure Vaults also cast this. However, sometimes these Hulks may cast this frontal twice in a row. I'm not sure if this is intended, but be very careful as this does a lot of damage. I'm pretty sure the dot stacks, so tanks should be really prepared for this damage. These units, unlike the Furies, cannot be stunned, so tanks will really need to be careful. Next to the Hulk is a Valshard Chunk. Much smaller, it only has one ability. It's a large stomp that if you don't step out of it, you'll take a lot of damage. It's pretty easy to dodge. And finally, there are Understone Drudges. They have no abilities. That's all the unique trash you encounter before the first boss. Really easy. You jump down into water, and you face the first boss, Rokmora. Rokmora normally starts the fight by casting Crystalline Ground, dropping Legos all over the arena. If you move on these Legos, you will take damage, so stand still if you're on it. It does recede after a few seconds, so all you have to do is wait. The boss is brittle, continuously summoning Blightshard Skitters that are identical to the crawlers seen earlier. They don't do anything except drop puddles of hurt when they die. These puddles do not despawn, so this fight is a race to see if you can kill the boss before you run out of space in the room. When the boss hits full energy, Rokmora casts Shatter, dealing big damage to all players and knocking everyone back. This will kill any Skitters alive. Be careful not to get knocked back into puddles. And the boss's final ability is Piercing Shards. Not unlike the Valshard Hulk we saw earlier, Piercing Shards is a frontal. However, it doesn't track the tank, so everyone should sidestep this, including the tank. It's a fairly mechanically simple fight that is mostly a DPS check. You slide down on a barrel and throw fish at fishermen. These fishermen do not give count, so you don't have to worry too much. The first mob you'd face is the Rockbound Pelter. They throw jagged discs at random players, just something for the healer to heal. The Pelter also frequently retreats, disengaging really far away from the party. This makes it difficult to group them up with other mobs. And the cave is quite open, so there aren't very many places to line of sight them. With the Pelter is likely a Mightstone Breaker. You'll see the Breaker a lot from this point onwards. They do a tank frontal that when it lands, drops a rock from the ceiling on every player. It does a lot of damage. And while you can dodge the rocks, they're so quick, practically I don't think you can. Because of this, pulling too many breakers at once is actually quite dangerous, so don't. Nearby, you might notice an Understone Drummer. If you happen to pull these, they'll start walking towards a drum and bang it. Every 6 seconds, they will summon a new Drogbar. You want to stop this at all costs, as you really don't want extra trash. In my testing, they summon breakers, and you really don't want more breakers than you can handle. Farther into the cave, you might encounter the Blightshard Shaper. They cast Stonebolt at random targets. You can interrupt it, and it would be helpful to interrupt them so you can pull them in with other mobs. Once in a while, they might summon a Petrifying Totem. It does damage and applies a debuff every second. If you stand in it for 10 full seconds, which is quite unlikely. Then you will be petrified for 10 seconds. So just don't stand in an obvious trap. The last mob you may encounter here before the second boss is the Burning Geode. They're normally near a wall and they cast Scorch, throwing fire swirlies around the room constantly. They don't have a lot of health, however, so you should kill them quickly to stop the swirlies from spawning. Those are all the unique mobs, and I do recommend killing the entire room before you pull the boss, to avoid pulling during the boss. The second boss is Ularogg Cragshaper. This fight has 2 phases, and we start the fight pretty ordinarily. The boss has Sunder, a tank hit. They cast Strike of Mountain, summoning hands to crush all players. Just walk out of it. I'm pretty sure you can walk through the hands, but do it at your own risk. If you don't dodge it, it does big damage to you, so really just dodge it. You don't have to walk very far to avoid the damage. Bellow of the Deeps is where the boss summons a bellowing idol. He does it occasionally, and the idol continuously drops rocks on random party members. There are no swirlies to indicate that a rock is dropping. So just like earlier, these rocks are basically unavoidable. You'll want to destroy this idol as fast as you can. That's it for the first phase. When the boss hits 100 energy, he will go to the middle of the room and summon 4 statues. Then the boss himself will turn into a statue. Then the statues will shuffle around the room. You must now identify which statue is the boss. Based on my testing, this is actually surprisingly difficult. Throughout this phase, rocks will continuously drop on all players. There is a lot of incoming damage, so you want to break the statue as fast as you can. Breaking the wrong statue is not a big deal, but it is wasted time. This is a race to see if you can kill the right statue before your healer is overwhelmed. After you break the right statue, the fight reverts back to phase 1, and you rinse and repeat. Amazingly, there are only 3 new unique enemies between boss 2 and boss 3. On the way to boss 3, you pass by some Drogbars doing some snail racing. Don't bother them if you don't need to. They're just enjoying their leisure time, like us. There are some Gnashers in the water if you need count. There will be some Tarspitter lurkers in the packs ahead, just like the ones we've seen in the first area. The first new mob you'll encounter is the Stoneclaw Grubmaster. They sometimes cast Stone Shatter, dealing some damage to all nearby players. Occasionally they'll cast Worm Call, summoning a Tarspitter grub. The grub is a larva and starts casting Metamorphosis for 10 seconds. If they finish their cast, they'll turn into a Rotdruel Grabber. When the grabber spawns, there'll be a large puddle of green around it. You'll want to step out of that. They may then cast Barbed Tongue, pulling a player immediately into melee range. These are actually quite dangerous, and the puddle of green actually hurts a lot. So you'll want to focus down the grubs as fast as you can so these never spawn. You'll need to pull the whole room to summon the third boss. Among the trash is some Tarspit grubs. Even though they have the same name as the grubs from earlier, they're not the same. These grubs don't do anything, they just melee. And we're already at the third boss, Naraxas. Naraxas normally starts the fight by casting Rancid Maw, applying a circle to multiple players. After a few seconds, they'll take damage and drop a puddle that slows players caught in it by 50%. It also slows enemies, which will be useful for the trash later on. You'll want to drop it slightly behind, as the tank will need it for a mechanic later on. The boss will summon Drogbar throughout the fight. They will start making their way to either side of the boss. If they successfully get there and say their voice line, the boss will eat them, giving the boss 1 permanent stack of Ravenous, a 50% buff to damage done. That is ridiculous. You cannot let the boss eat them ever. So you'll want to use the slow puddles from earlier to slow these guys so you can kill them. The boss then may cast Toxic Wretch, applying poison to all players. You'll want to use poison cleanses and heal through it. At 100 energy, Naraxas casts Spiked Tongue, latching onto the tank, and after a delay, will start pulling the tank into the boss. If the boss eats the tank will take a lot of damage. So the tank will want to run away aggressively. By right, the slow puddle should slow the tank's approach to the boss, which is why you want the slow puddles to be far away, so the tank can run into them. But in my testing, it didn't work, and the tank just got sucked in straight away. If the tank is eaten, the boss will also receive 1 stack of Ravenous. At 20% health, the boss frenzies, cancelling all current casts and enraging. Tanks, be sure you're in melee, as if there is no one in melee, the boss will cast Putrid Skies, dealing an absurd amount of group-wide damage. You jump down yet another hole and you're on your way to the last boss. There are breakers here, the ones we've seen before, and there's also demolishers. These demolishers cast Charskin, where they will grow into a stone giant. Take note of this mob as you will see it again later on the boss itself. When buffed by Charskin, the Demolisher will do 100% more damage, and then will immediately fixate on a player with Burning Hatred. You'll want to use stuns and slows here. Otherwise, the next mob you'll see is an Ember Husk Dominator. It's a really big Scorpion. Ember Swipe is a tank cleave, so don't stand near the tank. The Scorpion also casts Crystal Spike, shooting 3 projectiles at 3 players. It has no cast time, and they normally sync it up right after the cleave, so while it may appear that the cleave is doing damage to everyone, the cleave is only damaging in the tank's direction, and the spikes is what's damaging everyone. The Scorpions also cast Frenzy, making them do more damage and attack faster. You just want to soothe it. And the last trash mob in this entire dungeon is the Rockbound Trapper. They primarily spam cast Jagged Disc, dealing damage to a random party member. But they also cast Bound. They target the tank, and if they successfully finish the cast, they will stun the tank for 4 seconds in addition to doing damage. You'll want to interrupt this at all costs. And that covers every single trash mob in this dungeon. Really, really, really easy. And now on the last boss. This last boss is actually quite difficult. Dargrul has a buff called Magma Breaker, and every time the boss moves, they'll do group-wide damage, so you don't want to move the boss more than you need to. Occasionally, the boss will cast Crystal Spike, spawning it on a random player. It's a swirly, so step out of it. Take note of their positions, as you will need to use this for a later mechanic. The boss may cast Magma Sculptor, spawning a Molten Charskin that fixates on a random player. Charskins have Inferno, making them move faster and do more damage the longer it's alive. If you walk Charskins through crystals, they'll take 100% more damage for 10 seconds. That's really good. But you don't want to use up all your crystals as you'll need them for another mechanic later on. The boss has 2 tank hits, first in Landslide. It's a tank frontal that's really long. Tanks, be careful not to point this at any spikes, as if this hits any of the spikes, they will break. The boss may follow Landslide up with Molten Crash, dealing significant damage to the tank. And finally, at 100 energy, the boss may cast Magma Wave, dealing significant damage to all players within line of sight. Every tick takes out like half of your health bar. It's disgusting. You'll want to use the Crystal Spikes as cover. And at the end of Magma Wave, the boss will leave behind a Magma Pool. This Magma Pool then casts Lava Geyser occasionally, shooting out projectiles to 2 players. The projectiles do damage in a small AoE, so you should spread out a bit. The longer the fight goes on, the more of these geysers will spawn. So it is a DPS race to see if you can kill the boss before he overwhelms your party. And that's the whole dungeon. Mechanically, this dungeon is super easy, but tuning may prove this dungeon to be quite difficult in practice. I do think, however, that this dungeon will have one of the higher completion rates among the Season 2 dungeons, not least of which because it's quite short. I make these videos to give players a full overview of dungeons, as I like to be well informed of dungeon mechanics myself. I hope this was helpful. If you liked it, be sure to leave a like or subscribe, and I'll see you in the next dungeon guide.